So, dispatcher versus freight broker. What do I recommend? What do I think is a better position for you guys out there? Well, let's go through the difference between what a dispatcher does versus what a freight broker does. And also we'll talk about compensation in this video. And please stay tuned to the end where I will recommend what I think is better to become a dispatcher or a freight broker in 2024. So let's get into it. All right, so let's talk about the dispatch role in detail. What does a dispatcher do? So the dispatcher is actually the middle person between the driver and the company that he works for. A lot of dispatchers, what they do is they match available freight with available trucks. So for example, if there's 10, 12, or 14 power units in Atlanta, Georgia on a given day, the dispatcher is responsible for X amount of trucks. Here at ET Transport and a lot of the companies out there, what they do is you have a dispatcher, and that dispatcher is responsible for anywhere between 8 to 20 drivers, depending on the company and depending on the kind of work that that dispatcher does. Some bigger companies, they segregate the job, and smaller companies, a dispatcher pretty much handles everything in between the driver communication, between booking the loads, between order paperwork. That dispatcher can be responsible for everything or can be responsible for one or two things. A driver's point of contact in a trucking company is their dispatcher, and that dispatcher is responsible for anything that goes wrong either at the pickup or the delivery, dispatching the driver with information, proper information, what trailer number to take. They are also responsible to know driver habits. They're responsible to know what their drivers like. A lot of the times our drivers know, the service areas that drivers love to service. So for example, we have one driver that loves to go out west. So whenever that dispatcher gets their hands on a load going out west, she will dispatch the driver that she knows, or he will dispatch the driver that he knows to a load going out west. On the other side, you have the customers for the dispatcher. So the dispatcher has two customers. Either they work directly with a manufacturing plant or they're working for a freight forwarder or a freight broker. So they're constantly giving updates to their customer on where that driver is on the pickup, the delivery, the drop trailer, the border crossing. I mean, there's a lot of updates to give customers. There are some customers that want to know everything along the way, and there are other customers that couldn't care less. Just let us know when that freight delivered. Now, over the years, I would have to say that a dispatcher's job has, in one hand, became easier, and on another hand, it's become harder and harder. So for example, lately, as of the last, maybe 4 or 5 years, our dispatchers now, they need to know the driver hours. And because they're able to log into their ELDs, they can see which driver has how many hours left on their logbook. And based on that, they're going to give the proper driver a proper load. So for example, if there's a pickup that's 100 miles away and there's 3 drivers available and one driver only has, 2.5 hours left on his log, well, that dispatcher cannot give the load to that driver. So they are more in tune with what's happening with the driver on a day-to-day basis. Now, a lot of drivers feel like, dispatchers micromanage drivers, but I feel like, after a new dispatcher and a new driver work together for, a couple of weeks, they kind of get to understand one another and how they work. They kind of understand each other's language and how they work. Some dispatchers only prefer everything, through text messages and through emails. There are other dispatchers, I would say, that only prefer, phone calling and talking to their drivers. And same thing with the drivers. There's some drivers that don't want to talk to the dispatchers. All they want to do is, send me the information via text. And then there's other drivers that hate texting. All they want to do is, they want to be able to talk to their dispatcher. A little more about the dispatcher's role. A lot of dispatchers also book freight for their drivers. We have 10 or 15 trucks in Atlanta, Georgia, or we'll take Chicago, Illinois. We also have a lot of customers there. But sometimes you have, 7, 8 loads from the customers, and there are 4 or 5 drivers that are, they don't have the loads directly from the manufacturing plant. So what we do is we go on the load boards, obviously, and we are looking for the missing freight. So a lot of dispatchers are also accustomed to booking loads for their drivers. We have to talk a little bit about the salary of a dispatcher and how they climb up. Now, for those of you guys out there that want to become a dispatcher, don't forget that we do have our dispatch course. It's on the YouTube platform, and you're able to take our 9-hour course online and gives you access to information with me and into live sessions with me. But if you want more information, I can link down the form below. But a dispatcher's role, when it comes to salary, I would have to say that $45,000, which would be an entry-level position. They'll work 2-3 years, they'll climb up to $65,000. They'll work another 4 or 5 years, and they'll climb up to $70,000, $80,000, $90,000. But it also depends on the person and what they're good at. So larger companies have, these, I would say these tasks are segregated, where here at ET Transport, for example, we have the dispatchers that are dispatching drivers, and we also have the load bookers that all they do is they're on the load boards looking for loads for drivers or for available units. So for us, it's segregated. The ones that are talking to dispatchers are not the ones that are looking for the loads off the load boards. But I can honestly say that, dispatch has really evolved over the years. The role of a dispatcher has really changed over years. I mean, there's no more. I mean, when I started this, we used to fax everything in a carrier packet and initials and signatures and confirmations. And here, here was a confirmation that came through the fax. You would have to sign it and then you have to fax it back. Those days are long gone. I mean, everything is on emails today. So there are, there's a lot of technology that's coming out there to try to make a dispatcher's life easier. But I feel like, we covered a lot of points about what a dispatcher does. Their hours can vary. So I mean, our dispatchers here probably, and the companies that I know that work here, either in Canada or in the US, that, dispatchers' jobs are usually between 8 to 4:30, 8 to 5. And if you take, the dispatcher's role again has changed a lot, even in hours. Before, a dispatcher would work around the clock. I mean, they would probably start at 7:30, 8 o'clock, and then they would finish at 5:36, but they would always be on call. They would always be on their phone. They would, have phone calls coming in nonstop. Today, things have kind of changed where, labor laws have definitely kicked in. It's much better for the employee that they actually get rest at home. So that's really the role of a dispatcher. Now let's get into the freight broker. All right, so now let's talk about the freight broker's role. So a freight broker really connects a manufacturing plant and a trucking company together. All right, so his role is to establish a relationship with a manufacturing plant, to get on their weekly or daily request for trucks, and then they source out those lanes. So for example, let's say we had a manufacturing plant that, manufactures chocolate, and they distribute it to all over the world or all over North America. Now that freight broker, usually those manufacturing plants will have annual RFPs, but a lot of them have, 2 skids going here, 5 skids going there, 8 skids going here. So these manufacturing plants have freight brokers multiple freight brokers that they work with, and they will just, on a daily, they will just send one email to all 8 or 10 brokers that they work with that they need a rate from here to here. And then it's that freight broker's responsibility to go to their pool of carriers and to get the most competitive rate for that broker. And obviously they mark up. If a carrier tells them $500, they'll come back to the manufacturing plant and will say $700. Now there are some freight brokers out there that the carrier will tell them $1,000. They'll go back to their customer and they'll tell them $2,000. It depends on the relationship between the manufacturing plant and the freight broker. Now it's very easy for a freight broker to lose their customer, okay? And it's becoming harder and harder to become a freight broker these days because they have to source a reliable carrier. And if they didn't get a reliable carrier, you have to understand that this manufacturing plant or any manufacturing plant today is working with 10 different brokers. So they have to source out a reliable carrier. And if that carrier is not reliable, that freight broker is going to get a verbal beatdown by the manufacturing plant for doing a horrible job at sourcing out the carrier. Another thing that freight brokers do, and I talk about the freight brokers here at ET Transport, I'm also talking about freight brokers out there that I know, and we work with a lot of freight brokers. Another thing that they do is some of them handle the paperwork. So what do I mean by that? When a freight broker here establishes a new relationship with a manufacturing plant, and to set up the account, we have paperwork that we need on our end, and they all have paperwork that they need on their end. What's up? Sorry guys, my laptop just got taken away. But anyways, once the account is set up, then we're okay to do business. Now, don't forget that freight brokers usually mark up between 15 to 35%. That's what I see. In the last 18 months, as freight rates are starting to drop more and more, a freight broker's profit margins have really gotten slimmer and slimmer and slimmer. Why? Because these manufacturing plants got smart. They're working with multiple freight brokers. Now also there's every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, a different carrier is knocking on their door and they're telling them, hey, why are you using that freight broker when you can work with us directly? So now they don't only have the freight brokers that they're using, but they're also getting quotes directly from asset-based carriers. So that space is becoming more and more competitive. And how do we know that? A lot of the publicly traded companies, the brokerages, are reporting losses this year and over the last 18 months, and significant losses in gross revenues. So for manufacturing plants, there's a big shift between going brokerage or they're going to asset-based carriers. Now, another thing to remember, the way a freight broker makes money, I mean, a lot of them have a chip on their shoulder. They make money by by decreasing rates for carriers. So for example, let's say the manufacturing plant pays them, Toronto to Atlanta, Georgia, they pay them $2,000. Well, they go out and they find a carrier for $1,500. And the way that they make money is the more they can beat the carrier's rate down, the more money they make. So they're constantly hounding for rates, cheaper rates. Usually it's 10, 15, or 20, or 25% is the freight broker's salary. So usually they have the base plus a commission. So that's really the job of a freight broker. And I mentioned at the beginning of the video that I'm going to answer the question on what do I recommend for people out there to become a dispatcher or to become a freight broker. Well, in all honesty, I would have to ask you guys a couple of questions before I can answer that. So the first question I would ask you is your age, and the second question that I would ask you would be, where you live. So if I'm talking to somebody young in their 20s, 21, 22, 23, 24, and the person's still living at home, he doesn't have a wife and kids, then I probably would recommend for them to go the freight brokerage route, to become a freight broker for an asset-based carrier. Why is that? Because in order for you to establish your book of business, it takes years to do that. It takes years for you to get on the cycle of the RFPs of these manufacturing plants. Establishing a relationship is not so easy from today to today, and these manufacturing plants, they've seen it all, heard it all. So it takes a long time to build your book of business as a freight broker. And the pay is not the greatest at the beginning. Where you see a lot of reward is, a few years down the road, once you establish a relationship, once you have your connections, once you have those manufacturing plants giving you work to quote on. So that's really my honest opinion on how I would guide. So if you are, younger, I'd probably tell you to go to the brokerage side. If you don't have that many expenses, I'll tell you to go to the brokerage side. But if you are, in your 30s and you've just done one of our dispatch course and you're thinking to become a dispatcher, I would guide you in the way to become a dispatcher. And why is that? Because you can get yourself a job, an entry-level job for $40,000, $50,000. After 2-3 years of working in that role, you could probably find yourself a job paying $60,000, $65,000. And then after 5, 7, 8 years in that role, you'll probably find yourself a job, $90,000, $95,000, $100,000. It also depends how good you are. So there you have it, the difference between a freight broker and a dispatcher. Now, if I've missed anything, put the comments down below. Let me know what you think. I'm Ronen, and I'll catch you in my next video.